I'm going to share my screen to get the slides going. You all can let me know if you have the appropriate slide share. You see the full screen slide? Everybody okay?
Yes, we can see you, Belinda.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. So good to hear some friendly voices. So today I'm going to approach this through looking at remote informed consent, both as being similar and the same, as well as different, but still the same. So for you all that are familiar or know me personally, you know that sometimes during this month, that is how I can be a little bit the same, but, somewhat different. And don't be too scared because basically I'm still the same. So the objective for today will be to explore options, solutions for conducting remote informed consent, but we want to be compliant with the general requirements that have not changed. And then we'll look at some situation specific things like isolation patients. And then we'll look at how these vary, your options vary depending on the regulations that apply. So that's the objective, but my message is don't get bogged down in the details. This is a lot of information. So focus on each individual study, figure out first what rules apply, and then go back to the details and figure out what options are going to work for you for conducting your informed consents remotely. Okay, so first of all, let's just look at what's the same, what's not changed. Still 3 features. You're still providing information that a reasonable person would want. That may not be 30 pages for a reasonable person, but you're providing that information, trying to promote and enhance their understanding, and also assessing understanding. So that's not changed. And then promoting voluntariness. And the arrows represent this going on throughout the entire participation process. The components, these are in a nutshell. Keep in mind, we spend 4 hours on these in our informed consent workshop, but in a nutshell, you have an eligible subject, you have appropriate forms, and by that, I mean the forms are going to have the 9 basic required elements that is in the regulations, the purpose, the risk, benefits, alternatives, etc., and any additional elements that apply. Language understandable to the subject, lay terminology, information a reasonable person would want to know to make a decision, and organized in a way that facilitates their understanding. Both the form and the process should begin with that key information. So once again, that's why an individual would not participate, perhaps. Thinking of the reasonable person, and then approved by the IRB, your sponsors. But keep in the forefront of your mind, you're really writing it for the potential research subjects, your participants, okay? Even though you have to have all of those approvals. Correct people, so that's just people that have been authorized on the IRB application to obtain informed consent, as well as the participants, legally authorized representatives, parents, what have you. Effective process. We spend a lot of time on process in our workshop because this is where we move from the reasonable person to the idiosyncratic person. So this gives you an opportunity to have dialogue with the individual to figure out what are their motives, what is their health literacy, what might be their baseline knowledge of being in research in general. So if you're the one doing all the talking through the process and not the listening and the dialogue, then you've missed the boat on that particular area. Right time, everybody knows it's before, prior to participation. It also has to offer appropriate, adequate time for someone to consider their options and then continue on through the participation. Documentation being adequate. And what I mean by that is every one of the regulations I'm going to talk about today will say that the subject needs to sign and date. Okay, all of the regulations say that. And FDA can be pretty persnickety on this one because even if you date subject's consent line for courtesy, or you want to make sure they get the right date because they tend to mess it up, don't do it. FDA is very adamant that it be the subject that does the signing and dating. Beyond that, here at UK, we also follow what UK or good clinical practice states, which is you obtain the name of the person that's obtaining informed consent. So they also add their name and date to the consent document. And then for FDA regulated and best practice for clinical trials, it's going to be documenting in the subject case history, the who, what, when, where. So essentially, that's in a nutshell what has not changed. As we transition, though, to individuals staying at home, individuals that weren't able to come in, isolation patients, I mean, researchers, IRBs, everyone was scrambling to figure out how to do this. Did we get it right the first time? Maybe not. I'm not the IRB, full disclosure. I'm Office of Research Integrity, and I'm not an IT expert by any means, but I want to share what I have learned in studying this and reviewing this. And, you know, I don't think anybody in the country got it right perfect this first time. And I think that's okay. That's my opinion, but I think that's fine. I think we'll learn from it and go from here. So what remote consent is basically just trying to have a process where the investigator or designee and the potential participant can engage in a process that is very similar to the way it would be conducted in person under normal circumstances. So that would be the goal. You're going to have the same components. So what might change for a few of your studies might be a little additional verification on the correct people. That's only a few. You're probably going to have to change how you do the process, and then documentation may change for some of the studies. But that doesn't mean it has all of these change for every particular study, because the options for how these changes happen vary dependent on the regulations that apply. So that's why I say first thing, just figure out what rules apply. So I'm going to launch a quick poll that Michelle's going to throw up on the screen. And the question for this poll is, does the Department of Health and Human Services Common Rule regulations apply to all human research conducted at UK? You can answer yes, no, or I don't know. Doesn't matter, just give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, yes, 66% good, 27 no, and 7 no. Well, the answer to this one, just so you all are aware, is yes. Common rule regulations are going to apply to all human subject research at UK. Consider it the baseline, okay? Even exempt research has to come to the IRB to obtain that exemption under the common rule. So when I say during this presentation that common rule or DHH regulations apply, just consider that's going to be applying to you. From there, some of you also have to deal with FDA regulations. Some Hipaa may apply. So you're collecting protected health information. So you need to also account for Hipaa. Some may be less than minimal risk. Some may have additional sponsor requirements that would apply in remote informed consent. So that's going to be outside the scope of today's session. But just consider these more layers that are added on to this baseline. Okay. So you're going to figure out which rules apply. Next poll question, this is the last one. I'm not going to bug you with these very much. But the question is, does FDA allow the IRB to waive informed consent for minimal risk research? Yes, no, don't know. Okay, let's see what my results are. Okay, split on that one, 47, 43, and 9. And for the longest time, that was the case. FDA did not approve any kind of waiver of informed consent for minimal risk research. But in 2017, they changed based on the Cures Act and now will allow that, as well as Hipaa. Hipaa does have a waiver of authorization as well. Now, it's not something that's done for convenience purposes. It has to be justified. There's 5 specific criteria that must be met. And it's the kind of thing that you really could not do this research if it weren't for getting this waiver. Okay, so it's things like retrospective collection of real world data on a drug or device to get those clinical outcomes. And FDA is very interested in that real world data. So one way to do that is to do big data retrospective record reviews. So they will allow this waiver. The other one is cluster randomized comparative effectiveness studies, where hospital A uses drug A, hospital B uses drug B, and you're just going to compare the outcomes with those. You're not going to be able to consent to everybody that comes into that hospital. But if you can protect their rights and welfare and provide some assurances to the IRB, the FDA will allow that waiver. Now that's waiver of informed consent and authorization. Keep in mind that is getting rid of everything here. Okay, it's all gone. There is a different type of waiver, though, called waiver of documentation. If you have not had a chance to have experience with this, what this one is it only applies to research under that baseline common rule DHH regulations, not FDA and not Hipaa. Neither of those have a waiver of documentation. What this does is it simply removes this portion here, the signature part. Everything else exists. You still have forms, you still have process, you still have engagement. But the waiver of document basically waives the signature portion. So this could be an option for some minimal risk research that you're conducting. Okay, so think of those options first. Now, granted, most prospective clinical trials are not going to qualify for these waivers. So you will need to come up with a review process of some sort with remote consent. So first thing, what regulations apply to your study to know what options you have? Structure your plan to meet the context of the study, your subjects, your staff needs, and then you may need some contingency plans as well when you're trying to meet the individual needs of a participant and what their preferences are. So even something as simple as you're going to use a hard copy, say for instance, of the informed consent. How do you get it to them? Okay. If it's super long, it may not be appropriate to have them read it online or have to print it out on their own printer. It may be something you would send by express mail, that type of thing. We'll talk about e-consent separately. That's always an option, but I want to move that towards the end. Okay, if you have confidentiality concerns. Now, this isn't a requirement. I'm just saying if you have confidentiality concerns, use the university issued approved email accounts. Okay, they're equipped with data loss prevention features. And what this does is if you have words in your email, in the body of the email, like social security number, it'll automatically do things like encrypt that message and secure it. But you can also trigger that by putting these keywords in the subject line. And then the participant as the recipient would get the instructions on how to read and access the message. So that's an option. Also with email, some groups will have a blanket email for the study. We used to nickname our studies all the time. So just as you do that, making sure that that name isn't all telling, that it's nondescript. So, no one would know exactly what DCCT study is unless they're familiar with that. Versus UK incontinence study, is obvious, going to be fairly obvious. So just how you name those custom emails. As far as emails coming back from a participant, just disclosing that if it's unsecure email methods, that there is always a small chance that unauthorized users could gain access to that, and not asking subjects to provide social security numbers or sensitive information via that unsecured email. All right, moving on to process. There's nothing in any of the regulations that mandate one process over another. It could be telephone, it could be conference call. UK has HIPAA approved Zoom available and telehealth. And probably many of you have experienced having clinical visits in these formats over the past few months. And if you look at overall geographic areas, this was a study of 50,000 providers. It shot up tremendously during the month of April as far as using telehealth and telemedicine. And if we look at what happened here at UK, the director, Rob Sprang, was kind enough to send some data. And usually UK does somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 5,000 telehealth visits a year. But when the clinics begin to scale back on the in-person visits, and that's the purple line, it went down from about 66,000 and some down to 17,000. You see the green line immediately and phenomenally increase from 185 to 16,574 telehealth visits. So some of those may have been research, majority clinical. Irrespective, it sounds like clinical research has the same trend. Telemedicine use is up. Before COVID, 72% said they rarely, never used it. And now during, 64% have said we sometimes or often or even always use it. And there is intent with 73% indicating they plan to use it after COVID as well. So I think this will be a trend that we will see long term. Now, as we've moved to communicating in an online format, we know online communication isn't without its hiccups. So I have to share just something for fun.
Belinda, there's no sound.
Oh, sorry about that. Here.
We'll try that again. Let's see if you got it now.
Who's here? Tyler's
Do
here.
you have it?
Okay, the purpose of today's meeting
Yes,
is
ma'am. Thank you.
we'll do it in like 30 minutes. John.
Has joined the meeting.
Hi, John. Hi. I was just trying to go over the purpose of today's meeting, which is to discuss the deliver. Tyler.
Has joined the meeting.
Sorry, guys, I got cut off. Is Paul here? Send him an invite.
Put in your access code.
No. That's your PIN number.
It should be a 9-digit number.
Try pressing the pound key.
Paul.
Has joined the meeting.
So typically we can recover from these little glitches and they're just an inconvenience. But there is something that is important to acknowledge, and that there is still a digital divide in some areas in regard to access to high-speed, low-priced internet. The majority do have access, but there's still going to be some areas where you might have to have contingency plans. Also, technical skill could be an issue with some subjects, as well as their willingness to use limited data for research purposes. So just keep this in mind and think what you might need to describe in your IRB application for these kind of contingencies to recruit from these areas that have this issue. The other issue is special populations that can be an additional or quite a challenge in doing remote consent. And certainly homeless, economically disadvantaged, prisoners may be an issue, impaired consent capacity may require just some additional hoops. Minors has some additional requirements as well as far as privacy online. And then your isolation patients. And this is one we promised to talk a little bit more about. And I'm going to share two examples. The first one is non-FDA regulated research. So for this one, I didn't have to comply with FDA Part 11, and it was to reach isolation patients with the CCTS bank. And Ken Campbell, Dr. Campbell graciously did a short demo on how they built this, and some things I'll point out that I thought was very beneficial is areas where you could build in some demographics to verify the participant. And as well, there is a pre-consent form, I think is what they call it, where the individual obtaining informed consent can select their name from a drop-down menu. And what that does is it will embed their name into the signature page of the informed consent. So this is a really neat feature how this was set up. Now, if you're going to be doing FDA regulated research and e-consent, it would need to be Part 11, FDA Part 11 compliant. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But the other issue is if you're going to use a hard copy, it may go in and not come out. So you can usually get it in there through a clinical staff, but it's most likely going to be incinerated or red bag waste. So we asked back in May, we sent a case, I guess you would say, and question into FDA and asked, can the PI verbally consent without the subject having to sign a document that would most likely be incinerated? And remember, FDA doesn't have that waiver of documentation that I mentioned a little bit ago. They said no. And so we asked again, and they said no. And the issue is they say that the options that they describe in their FDA clinical trials during COVID FAQ guide, and it's actually question 10, are adequate and should be attainable. So those options are either to photograph, if you can obtain a photograph of the signed and dated document, that would be one method you could use, or having an additional witness. And the witness may not necessarily be seeing anyone sign, but they could listen on a phone call and hear the subject say yes, or the LAR say yes, we do agree to participate and we are signing this document and dating it. And then the investigator and the witness attest in the case record that this was conducted that way. Okay, so that's their options for isolation. And in addition, e-consent could be considered. But one thing I want to point out here is remote consent and e-consent are not necessarily the same thing. So with remote consent, what we're talking about is situations where the research participant and the study personnel are in a different location. Okay, they're not together. And it's a virtual process of some sort. It could be a hard copy paper, it could be an electronic document, some kind of hybrid in between. E-consent, conversely, is going to be using an electronic document and process. And it could be either remote or it could be right next to somebody. You can use e-consent where you're handing over a iPad or something and going through the consent process right next to them. So just to differentiate those two things and to give you the official definition from the document that I use a lot, which is the FDA and OHRP's joint guidance on electronic consent. They define it as an electronic system process that may employ multiple electronic media, including text, graphics, audio, video, podcasts, passive interactive websites, biological recognition devices, card readers, to convey information related to the study and to obtain it and document informed consent. So that's pretty high tech, okay? But it's not all of these things, it's any and, okay? This is the link to the guidance document that I mentioned. We have a Cliff Notes version on our website for quick reference. And how you deal with this as far as EIRB is to describe your process. And the IRB is going to want to know things like, how are you going to obtain the signature? Is it compliant with applicable regulations? Will the subject get a copy of their signed document? And then you can upload a representation of the e-consent as a PDF, and that's what will end up getting the stamp, okay? If the subject sees that and it's, it's exactly the same, that's all you should need to do. But if you have bells and whistles, if you have features that the subject will actually see, say for instance, pop-up definitions or a video, that's what link you need to provide, or a demo for the IRB, so that they can see what those features are that you have enabled. And e-consent does have ability to do some of those really cool things. So, if the information is voluminous, you can chunk it. You can format things with headers, shading, white space, videos, graphics. I love the where you hover the cursor and a definition pops up, or you have hyperlinks for more information. So you can do some neat things. It does need to be able to easily navigate for the participant, both forward and back. And people do tend to read in F pattern, so you can kind of build it that way, where you take advantage of the main headers and then bullets, so that people will notice the most important things you want them to take from reviewing the consent. One of the neatest things that I have seen, and I wish I could remember who put this in their red cap consent, because it was a simple consent, but they chunked the information and then they added in a knowledge check question for the subject to answer periodically, so that they could key in on those points they wanted the takeaway points to be. So it was a simple fix, simple build, and able to build the knowledge checks right into the form. Some of the fancier programs can collect metadata, say for instance, on how long someone stays on a particular area. You do want to make sure it's formatted for whatever devices they might be using. And like I said, providing the signed copy for the subject. The things that vary, the two elements that vary depending on the regulations that apply, are identity verification and signature. So I want to talk about that a little bit more in detail. So for identity verification, what does DHHS say? That's the common rule that applies to you all. All they say is use a risk-based approach, use your judgment, decide if it's warranted. So you can think of this as if you were to verify in person someone's identity. You're looking at a medical record, or you ask for their ID. I do that all the time when I go to the clinician. You give them the ID and your insurance. Then do it in the consent process for research. If not, it's only DHHS, you're fine not to do it, okay? So they say use a risk-based judgment approach. Hipaa does not require, but they do recommend to verify identification. FDA, not surprising, Part 11 does require some form of identity verification. All of these, though, every one of these do not specify how. Okay, so it could be something as simple as I'm using the personal email. It could be a security question or code. It could be show me your driver's license. So it can be a very simplistic method or a more complex system check that verifies the identity of the individual. Okay. E-signatures, the other thing that varies with the regulations. So if you look at the definition from that FDA guidance and OHRP guidance, electronic signature is very broad in how it's defined. It's any symbol, series of symbols executed, adopted, or authorized by the individual to be their legally binding equivalent of their handwritten signature. Okay, so that's the broad category. The most secure of these is what's called the digital signature. So that's the one that uses the more cryptographic methods. It's got rules and parameters set so that it will protect the document against any kind of changes, and it verifies the identity of the signer. Okay. So what does UK say about e-signatures? There is an administrative reg, and it does indicate that UK accepts e-signatures as equivalent to handwritten signatures as long as it's legally valid. Okay, so, and it is a legal valid thing in the state. What about the regulations? Let's go back through those. DHHS common rule. This is everybody. This is all. They do permit if legally valid within the jurisdiction. Okay, so there, go for it. You can use them. What does HIPAA say? Go for it as well. They just say, as long as it's legally valid, secure, and you're not, having any risk to the integrity of protected health information through the signature process. Okay. Not surprising, FDA permits it, but once again, they say it must be compliant with FDA Part 11. Okay, so you're kind of seeing a trend in how these go based on which regulations apply. So if you're just DHHS, common rule, you may be able to build your consent in Qualtrex and it'd be completely adequate. Okay, it's a program where you use your link blue to log in. From what I've heard, it's especially useful for collecting information or surveys from other UK employees, staff, students. If we layer on HIPAA, say for instance, you're DHHS and HIPAA regulated, then REDCap might be the best choice. Okay, that's behind the firewall at UK, maintained on UK servers, secure. And just to give you an example, I know some of you probably were with me. We attended the REDCap training this past week on how to set up a consent. So they do have an e-consent template available. In signing your consent document, it can build in these verification points to verify you are who you say you are. You answer a question to say, yes, I do consent. Okay, so it's not agree, it's yes, I do consent to participating in the study, sign. And then there's an additional verification. So that verification step says, I certify that the information in the document is correct, and I understand that clicking submit will electronically sign the form. And signing this form electronically is equivalent to my physical signature. And upon submitting that, you get the green box, and also copies will be sent off by email to the subject and the research participant. And remember that CCTS also developed the way to have that little pre-step, so you could also have in this signature page the person obtaining informed consent embedded, the name. Okay, so that's going to be an option that will meet a lot of your needs. For those of you that are FDA Part 11, you have to follow those requirements because you're FDA regulated. And I will say, yes, that's a lot of clinical research, but overall, as far as research at UK, it's a very small percentage. Okay, that may be surprising to you, but it actually is as far as what the IRB reviews. So what does this mean? And I'm not a 21 CFR Part 11 expert because I don't have IT expertise. Okay? But what it does mean is that it's a federal regulation that considers any electronic records, any electronic signatures or handwritten signatures on electronic records to be trustworthy, reliable, and generally equivalent to the handwritten signature executed on paper. So that in and of itself doesn't sound all that menacing. It doesn't specify how you get the electronic signatures. Okay. They do suggest in their guidance a few options. They mention digital signatures. They mention computer readable ID cards like you use at the hospital where you scan your badge. They mention biometrics. So that's, we're getting like the big mission possible kind of 007 with a retina scan or fingerprint. And they mention username and password combinations. Okay. So that doesn't sound all that good as well. Okay, I hear some feedback. Can you all hear me okay?
We are getting some feedback, Belinda.
I'm gonna try to put this back on. Let's see if that will help some. So the idea with this is that FDA doesn't say you must use this signature or that signature. They leave.
They do have suggestions. Okay, does that help any?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, great. And remember, the digital was the cryptography, the one that is the most secure. Okay. So I often wondered, what is so difficult about obtaining a certification that says something is FDA Part 11 compliant. Because, we've already looked at the authorization of identity. They don't specify how you do it. They say it's just required. The electronic signature, they don't specify one or the other. They just say it's required and it has to be legally valid. But there are some additional things that are considered enforceable provisions of this regulation. One is education and training on the system and the documentation of that. Others are documentation controls. So there has to be quite a bit of tracking, date stamping, chain of custody, so that there is absolutely no question of who did what in the system. In addition, there's operational device checks. So things like the password and ID and password, they have to have password checks, like you have to change it every so often. You have to have password loss management, methods to detect unauthorized use. There has to be additional security systems set up, either if it's an open system or a closed system. So I think it's these additional areas that can make it more complex in saying something is or is not FDA Part 11 compliant. I am not an expert, as I said, in IT, so I did try to research some information that I will share with you. None of these that I'm going to mention are anything that has been approved by the IRB or ORI or endorsed or anything to that effect. I'm just trying to give you as many options as I find out information from. One key thing is none of these, though, out of the box tend to be completely compliant, because they almost always will require some customer responsibilities, either in setting a feature one way or another, or demonstrating compliance, or having a policy on not sharing your password, or showing documentation of training. So there will always be some responsibilities of the user. Now, we know there's tons of commercial products out there. These are the ones you may see your sponsors purchasing and making available. So these do have links that you'll have in your handout if you want to investigate them. I have no experience with any of these. I have read that some of them are providing free or discounted access during COVID. Okay, so if you choose to look at any of those. Others that I have found information on, Docusign has a Part 11 module. So it's not the standard Docusign. It is a module where they've gone in and actually disabled regular features in order to be compliant. Okay, they have this envelope type of system where it provides a signature manifestation, audit trail, and tamper-resistant digital seal. Once again, though, if you go to the website, there's going to be information on why the program is compliant, but it's also going to have the customer responsibilities in order to be compliant. Adobe Sign, some of you have experience with that. It's actually the only one I have experience with, because we use it for our standard operating procedures, since we're able to send it to our director, IRB members, or chairs in sequence and get all of those signatures in one send. It's cloud-based. Authorized users can upload the consent into the portal and email that to prospective participants. There's various options for validating their identity. Once again, though, if you look at the manual, there'll be 2 columns. One goes through every key part of Part 11 and how the system is compliant. The other column, once again, goes into the customer responsibilities. All right, so FDA, based on hearing lots of investigator concerns about dealing with Part 11 during the pandemic, made one app available called COVID My Studies app. This is a digital app they actually developed to collect real-world data that they're interested in, clinical data. But in May, they offered it up at no cost to be able to use for remote consent. It's available on Apple, Google Play. And the way this works is you actually would have to contact them and send your informed consent to this team that manages and will return the consent to you within the app. They also will manage if you have changes. I don't know anyone that has used this option so far. If you do, I'll be interested to hear what kind of feedback you have as far as turnaround times and so forth and working with the team. So if you have to comply with Part 11, I can only see a couple of you on the screen. I can't see everybody's faces, and I don't know if you're in this kind of position at this point. But do know that that there is a slight reprieve. So last month, FDA issued a statement in their in an edit. It's actually question 25 now on their clinical trial COVID-19 guidance, where they gave a tiny bit of latitude on Part 11 during COVID. And what this states is that when an electronic system that is Part 11 compliant is not available, regulated entities must have an alternate means of obtaining the required signatures. Handwritten wet ink, well, duh, we knew that one. But they also say handwritten stylus or finger drawn signatures executed on an electronic document and then printed and appropriately witnessed. So one thing that popped out on me is this handwritten part. And I don't know if if you've seen this, I sent this announcement out on the October Vice President for Researchers COVID listserv. But if you didn't notice it, this could be a significant option for some people to use when an electronic system is not available, at least just during COVID. So after reading this, I followed up with FDA and asked an additional question. And I asked, okay, would that latitude extend to using a mouse and a cursor to draw your name on the electronic document? And they did reply this time with a yes. The mouse cursor still in your hand, you're still drawing your signature, and that would be considered a handwritten signature. And to the signature portion only, 21 CFR Part 11 would not be applicable. So this was significant, I think. Now that doesn't mean that every part, remember that slide I showed of the enforceable issues with Part 11, it's more than just the signature, okay? It's passwords, it's tracing and tracking and chain of custody. But at least for this portion, if you do a process that's somewhat of a hybrid and you have an electronic signature and you don't have a Part 11 compliant program available, these handwritten, cursor written, mouse signed documents are temporarily okay. So what FDA's terminology they usually use is we will use enforcement discretion. In other words, yes, it's a rule, but we're going to lay off of it for now and not enforce that rule. So with remote informed consent, same general requirements apply, okay? There are different operations you will need to do, but those are going to vary depending on which rules apply. So start just figuring out which rules apply to the study so you know what your options are, because there's no reason to apply the most stringent of requirements when that's not warranted, okay? And then in general, you're still promoting respect for persons, you're still providing information they would need and ensuring their comprehension and promoting the voluntariness for remote informed consent. And with adversity, if it triggers adaptation, necessity breeds innovation, eventually what is very novel in the beginning becomes more commonplace. And perhaps we can continue to use some of this in the future to streamline or even try to reduce racial, geographic, socioeconomic barriers to participation. So I'm very hopeful with that. All right, so wanted to leave time, about 10 minutes it looks like, for questions. And I will move off screen sharing so I can see some, if there's chat questions in here.
Hi, Belinda. I'll start I had already posted the link to the CRU videos. That link works for me, everyone. But I'm going to post the corrected one in the chat. I'll see if I can link it while Belinda's answering some questions. You link to the
Right.
recordings from our CCTS YouTube channel, and there's a link on our website. So I'll put that in the chat in just a minute.
Great. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to try to read here. Linda writes to everyone. Michelle, how do you get access to the recording? The link above, we've got that. Okay, could not be found. All right, any other questions? Okay. Okay, so Lavoria Williams, Dr. Williams says, I like the idea of extending our reach with the use of e-signatures. Glad that we have this. I'm glad that there's options that will work for lower risk research as well. So I think that if we can use some of these lessons learned and some of these new practices to reach out to underserved populations, that's great. I like that you can use hybrids. So you may be able to send a hard copy, but then still obtain an electronic signature, and that's okay. And I did verify the Hipaa portion as well with Richard Chapman, just to make sure. Okay, another from Cassandra. Do you have, Cassandra Lambert asks, let's see, suggestions, recommendations for remote consent, e-consent, when parents, legally authorized representatives may be involved? Are there special considerations? I think that's a great question, because I think the special considerations are more relative to informed consent in general. So it may be the kind of thing where if there's a parent involved, you'll still need to get assent. That one might be a little more tricky on getting assent of a child versus parent permission. You would do it the same way you're going to get informed consent from an adult. The assent may be that you would provide the script as well and do that verbally with a minor. One thing that I mentioned on the one slide, the COPPA rule, which is Online Privacy Act, requires that anyone under the age of, I think it's 13, have parental permission. So those ages are a little different if you're doing the electronic informed consent online. So it's a little different than what you might see with IRB rules, which is going to be, you use your judgment on when someone can understand and be able to actually sign an assent form. Okay. So that might be one that we work through if you have that situation. Okay. Okay, from Marietta, can you talk about the pecking order for LAR consent? And that's become a challenge during COVID, as a number of the folks on the LAR list may also be hospitalized. Oh my gosh, and unable to provide consent for the family member. That is tough. So our IRB informed consent SOP follows what the hospital follows. And there's a section that will talk about legally authorized representative and the chain. And then there's additional one for if you are a parent or wards of the state. And, so you can refer to that. But if everyone in the family is also hospitalized or unavailable, I don't know what you're going to do in that case. It might be that you're going to come back to the IRB and it's going to be study specific, because if this is something that is life-saving treatment study, it's going to be treated different than if it is, say, just a banking study where you want to obtain a sample specimen, that type of thing. So we do get those calls periodically where it's to the point of we don't have an LAR. What are our options? What can we do? So it's typically handled on a case-by-case basis. Okay. All right, Michelle has provided another link that will get you to the CCTS YouTube channel. And I have provided handouts that she can share as well, so you can reach those links. as far as all of the different programs for Part 11. Let's see.
Linda, I have a
Yes,
question
Linda.
for you. The very last section, when you talked about witnessing signature with the use of a pen,
The iPad.
stylus, or a mouse, those are only going to be in situations where someone's not in isolation. If they're in isolation, we're not going to be able to use those tools, correct? So we're still back to what you already mentioned with
Yeah.
witnessing the picture or someone hearing it on the phone, right?
Or someone hearing on the phone. The way I understand it, there's a few rooms that have smart TVs that you might be able to work something out, but still, I mean, you can't hand in an iPad to isolation and expect to get it back. So yeah, that's still a tough one.
So my other question has to do with, we have a study right now where people could potentially, they're fine when they start. They could potentially get COVID once they're on the study. And then now they have a caregiver who we need to fill out data. And we're going to have to consent the caregiver.
Mhm.
We're probably going to have to do, it sounds like to me, some kind of remote, maybe e-consent process,
Yeah.
which we hadn't thought of, because we don't want to have to consent all these caregivers on the front end when the person, when
Yeah.
they get sick, we don't even know who the caregiver is going to be.
So if this is a consent that only is going to be, I mean, you're not testing anything in these individuals. They're just providing clinical data, correct? Or outcomes
Correct.
data.
Correct.
Then I would think that you could use a fairly simplistic remote e-consent process. I mean, that would be my suggestion. Now, once again, I'm not the IRB, so I'm not the one that stamps these as approved, but you're not testing in that LAR. You're just asking them to provide clinical data and fill out some of the forms on the subject's behalf. So,
but Belinda, the thing that complicates it a little bit more is that it is an FDA regulated
protocol
study.
Exactly.
I
I still would try.
We're going to try, we believe we're supposed to get e-consent, which will make it much easier, but it's still just going to, there's not an easy way to do this.
Is the sponsor providing anything for the sites? No, for this situation?
2 iPads.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I think one of the things, Belinda's been very politically correct to get you to appreciate our relationship with the FDA related to this. We took a very, I don't want to say we were attempting to push the envelope, but we were doing what we thought would be a very appropriate step. And the FDA was not willing to budge because it would have required them to, quote, write an exception. And so Belinda and I can attest that we tried pretty hard.
Twice.
Yeah. And it was a little frustrating because behind the scenes, they actually came back and told us, we agree, but we aren't going to write the exception because they're fearful of how it could be misused in other environments, not necessarily the environment that we were talking. So frustrating.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I think that's everything so far. Any other questions? Thank you all so much. I will definitely continue to follow this, and every so often the FDA does update their questions for running clinical trials during COVID with little bits and pieces that they've added to some of these. They're up to 25 questions now for that. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that, and I send those out. Post them on our website as well, and I send them out on the VPR's COVID updates as we do learn those. So we'll stay tuned, and I think the bottom line is document your process, figure out which rules apply, and in the end, it's the same because you're respecting participants, and we're all scrambling to try to do the right thing. So,
Linda, I just had another thought. on some of these remote with the advent of telemedicine,
Mhm.
we would be following FDA's rule if we send a consent paper document
Yeah.
to this person and we watch them on telemedicine sign it, we have a witness, and then we could follow that in that path, correct?
Correct. You would have the witness and the person obtaining informed consent attest and put that in the source record.
Okay.
Attest that you visually witnessed. And I think it, visually witnessed, or if it ends up on a phone call and it's not telemedicine, they verbally indicated that they are signing and dating the document.
That's just another avenue, another way to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the thing. There's lots of avenues. There's lots of options. It's just having that framework of where you are in the regulations to be able to know what those options are for you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you, Belinda, for this great presentation.
There's one more question in the
What's
chat,
that?
Belinda. You see it from Marta?
Could the witness be a video recording? So, Marta, how are you talking about how would that work? Oh, okay. So say for instance, you have a way to video record the telemedicine session and you're showing visually the individual signing and dating the informed consent. I mean, that sounds great.
Yes, that's what I was thinking
Basically,
of. Like
yeah.
if like using Zoom or some system that can record the interaction. That would count as a witness, right?
I think it would. And actually, I believe there is something in that question 25 on the COVID FDA guidance on that as well, if you choose to record. So yeah,
Excellent.
that would work.
Thank you.
Would there be any HIPAA regulations with doing that and keeping the video and
Yeah, that's the other thing. Submit it, propose it. We always have HIPAA review. So, if you describe it in your informed consent process, and we'll have one of the privacy specialists review it and see if there's any concerns there. To me, the main thing is in your authorization, you're going to list that. Okay, so list that as this is a identifier we're obtaining, and here's what we're using it for or disclosing it for, so that it's clear and they're agreeing to that from the front end. All right. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.